For 200 years, families scattered across the ridges of the Tennessee-Virginia border insisted they were Portuguese, not African, not mixed, not anything the law of their era would have punished them for. Portuguese. Specifically, a claim precise enough to survive on census forms, in family Bibles, in stories told to children who grew up believing it as fact. DNA testing just proved every generation of that claim wrong. The Melungeons were never Portuguese. Their direct paternal line traces to sub-Saharan Africa, and the science is no longer ambiguous about it. The Melungeons emerged in the written historical record in the late 1700s and early 1800s, when Anglo-American settlers pushing into the remote ridge and valley terrain of what is now Tennessee, Virginia, and Kentucky encountered communities already established in the region's most isolated pockets, people with dark complexions who spoke English, practiced Christianity, and yet fit into none of early America's rigid racial categories. Neither fully white, black, nor Native American under the law, the Melungeons occupied a legal and social no-man's land in a country whose entire system of rights, land ownership, and personal freedom depended on exactly which racial box a person could claim. Their own explanation for who they were shifted over time, but one version dominated for generations. Portuguese ancestry, sometimes elaborated further into shipwrecked Portuguese sailors, sometimes into more exotic variations involving Turkish soldiers, Mediterranean traders, or survivors of the lost Roanoke colony. None of these claims were random folklore, drifting free of any practical purpose. Claiming Portuguese ancestry specifically was a documented legal survival strategy, because Portuguese meant European, and European meant white under a legal system that made whiteness the precondition for nearly every civil right worth having. Jack Goins, a Melungeon descendant who spent roughly 40 years researching his own family's history, found ancestors officially recorded as Portuguese on an 1,880 census, a piece of paper that functioned less as an accurate ethnic record than as a document actively protecting the family from the legal consequences of being classified any other way. Given how consistently this specific claim was maintained, reinforced by documentation, community consensus, and the simple practical necessity of surviving under racially discriminatory law, you might reasonably assume that after 2 centuries, the claim had effectively become the truth in every way that mattered, regardless of what a genetic test might eventually say about it. Before we get to what the DNA actually found, it's worth sitting with how high the stakes were for that specific claim to hold up. This wasn't an idle question of ancestry tourism. Melungeon families built entire legal identities, land rights, and personal safety around this specific European origin story, sustained across multiple generations in a legal environment that would have stripped away rights and protections the moment that identity was successfully challenged. In 2012, a study led by genetic genealogist Roberta Estes and Melungeon researcher Jack Goins, published in the Journal of Genetic Genealogy, tested Y-Chromosome and mitochondrial DNA from Melungeon descendants to settle the question directly. The results were unambiguous. The paternal line, traced through Y-chromosome DNA passed from father to son, showed predominantly sub-Saharan African origin. The maternal line, traced through mitochondrial DNA, showed predominantly northern or central European origin. There was no significant genetic evidence of Portuguese ancestry, no Turkish signal, no Mediterranean or Middle Eastern component, none of the specific origins the community's own oral tradition had insisted on for 2 centuries. Here's a question worth sitting with before we get to what this actually means. If the genetic pattern is this clear, sub-Saharan African fathers, European mothers, why did the community land on Portuguese specifically, rather than simply admitting European and African mixed ancestry from the start? The answer traces back to exactly when this admixture likely occurred. Researchers placed the founding unions at the root of Melungeon ancestry in early colonial Virginia, a period before the harshest racial laws had fully hardened into place, when relationships between free African men and European women, while not without risk, were not yet universally illegal or as severely punished as they would become in later decades. As racial laws tightened across the colonial and early American South, the descendants of those unions faced an impossible choice: openly acknowledge African ancestry and lose legal standing entirely, or construct an alternative European origin story specific enough to survive scrutiny. Portuguese ancestry threaded that needle almost perfectly: exotic enough to explain unusual features, European enough to claim full legal whiteness. If a community successfully protecting itself for 2 centuries using a specific, deliberately constructed origin story is the kind of quiet historical survival strategy that impresses you, that's exactly why it's worth subscribing now, because this channel keeps finding populations whose official story and actual genetic history diverged for entirely rational, often life or death reasons. And if your own family carried a specific origin claim passed down as unquestioned fact, something more precise than a vague guess, tell us in the comments, because the Melungeon case suggests those specific, confidently repeated claims are exactly the ones worth testing directly, rather than dismissing as either obviously true or obviously false. The sex-specific pattern this study found deserves its own attention, because it runs in the opposite direction from the admixture pattern found in most other African-European mixed populations across the Americas. In the overwhelming majority of documented cases across this channel's coverage, European men fathered children with African or indigenous women, a pattern rooted directly in the power imbalances of slavery and colonial conquest. The Melungeon pattern inverts this specific dynamic: African men, European women. That inversion matters historically because it suggests these founding unions likely involved free or relatively autonomous African men in early colonial Virginia, rather than the coercive dynamics of the plantation system that shaped so much of the rest of the hemisphere's admixture history, a genuinely different origin story hiding underneath a population that later generations had every legal incentive to obscure completely. The human reaction to this finding, once it finally arrived, deserves acknowledgement on its own terms. Jack Goins, the researcher whose own genealogical obsession helped drive the study into existence, had his own DNA tested and got a result showing African ancestry so unexpected to him personally that he requested it be run a second time, then a third, each test returning the identical result. Roberta Estes, the study's lead researcher, later described the community reaction bluntly. A great many people were upset by the findings, having grown up entirely certain their families were Portuguese or Native American, never African. A 2-century-old identity suddenly confronted with genetic evidence it had never been designed to survive. It's worth explaining exactly what the legal stakes of misclassification actually looked like in practice, because losing rights understates how severe the consequences could become. Across the antebellum South and well into the 20th century, legal racial classification determined whether a person could vote, own land, testify against a white person in court, marry freely, attend certain schools, or avoid being subjected to increasingly restrictive vagrancy and labor laws that specifically targeted anyone classified outside the white racial category. Tennessee and Virginia both maintained legal frameworks during the 18th and 19th centuries that treated free people of color as a distinct, heavily restricted legal class, regardless of how long their families had lived in a given community or how thoroughly they had integrated into local life. For Melungeon families specifically, maintaining a European origin story wasn't a matter of social preference or family pride. It was, in many documented cases, the difference between retaining land their families had already lived on for generations and losing legal standing to keep it entirely, a threat serious enough to explain why the same specific claim held firm across dozens of families and multiple generations without significant variation. This also helps explain why the Portuguese claim specifically, rather than a more generic European origin story, proved so durable. Portuguese identity carried just enough documented historical plausibility, Given Portugal's own centuries of Atlantic and Mediterranean seafaring and its historical presence along trade routes that did occasionally bring genuinely mixed heritage sailors and settlers into contact with the American colonies, to survive scrutiny from neighbors and local officials who had no direct way to verify or disprove it. It offered a story specific enough to sound researched rather than invented, while remaining vague enough that no single family needed to produce documentation connecting them to an actual named ship, port, or ancestor. That combination, plausible but unfalsifiable, is precisely what allowed a single origin claim to hold across an entire scattered population for 2 centuries without collapsing under its own inconsistency. It's worth noting how contested this finding remained even after publication, because the reaction wasn't universal acceptance. Some Melungeon descendants and researchers pushed back against the 2012 findings, arguing that the study's sample size and definition of who counted as a genuine Melungeon family were too narrow to represent the full range of communities the term has come to describe, since Melungeon has, over the decades, expanded from its original application to roughly 40 specific families along the Tennessee-Virginia border into a broader catch-all label applied to dozens of mixed ancestry communities across the wider Appalachian region. That methodological debate is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing, and it means the specific African-European founding couple pattern documented in 2012 describes the core, historically named Melungeon families most directly, even as the broader Appalachian mixed ancestry landscape likely contains other communities with their own distinct, not yet fully tested origin stories layered underneath a shared regional label. For Melungeon descendants today, the identity has undergone a genuine transformation since 2012, moving from a shameful secret, many families actively concealed, to a subject of active genealogical pride and organized cultural exploration, with heritage organizations, family history projects, and academic partnerships now working specifically to document and preserve Melungeon history with the accuracy the original survival strategy never allowed. The story didn't need to stay hidden anymore, because the specific legal danger the Portuguese claim was built to protect against has been gone for generations, even if the habit of the story outlived the law that originally required it. What the Melungeons prove, with a clarity few other populations in this series can match, is that a 200-year-old identity, reinforced by documentation, family tradition, and total community consensus, can still turn out to be entirely constructed rather than remembered, built not from confused memory but from a specific, rational calculation about what a family needed to claim in order to survive. The Portuguese story protected real families for 2 real centuries. It just was never, at any point, actually true.